We're lucky enough to have Rob come and talk to us from Cosimmetry, and your talk's going to be about human-centered AI, helping humans to make wiser decisions under deep uncertainty. I think I could do with a bit of that in my personal life as well, never mind just in the rest of life and work. So for those of you who don't know Rob, he's co-founder and the CEO of Cosimmetry Ltd. And he's got around 30 years of experience combining human wisdom, logic, data, modeling, and AI to support complex decisions. His interests and expertise lie in the science and art of making better informed, more rigorous decisions regarding complex challenges. And he started out as an engineer building computer models to improve the effectiveness of aircraft operations. And then that developed into analysis to support major procurement decisions. And that's included such things as the design and procurement of the Queen Elizabeth class aircraft carriers. And certainly Glenn and I were lucky enough to actually be on board that a few weeks ago, and it is a big beast. That was quite impressive. And also the F-35 aircraft. So then from 2005 to 9, Rob commissioned analysis to support mod strategy and policy, including for conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Also led analysis for 2 UK strategic defence and security reviews, and also been seconded to the Pentagon. So if we fast forward 6 years, he left government for, in his own words, the metaverse technology unicorn Improbable. And there he led a cutting-edge research team before leaving to start Cosimmetry. And that develops disruptive tools to help humans and machines collaborate on complex, urgent decisions. So there'll be a chance to ask questions at the end. Use the chat if you wish, or at the end you can just wait and then raise your virtual hand. Please keep everything at official, nothing above official, and we will be recording the talk, and the link will be shared in the next CAISS newsletter. So I will come off camera now, and over to you, Rob.
Thank you so much, George. Just check everyone can hear me all right.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Excellent. And I will share the screen. Can you just confirm you can see that?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, we can see that.
Okay, excellent. Well, it's lovely to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me, and a real pleasure. I'm going to talk about something that I know a lot of people in this call know a lot about. So happy to have a engaging conversation about how to bring your wisdom to play in this area. But basically, I'm going to talk about what is perhaps at the moment the slightly forgotten but very important edge of AI, which is about helping humans to make what I would call wiser decisions under deep uncertainty. And I know it was sort of in jest, George, when you said that you could do with some of this. I think that's the point. We all have to make decisions where we really don't have enough data to support our ideal decision-making processes. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, is how do we get solutions that are good enough to problems where we just don't have the time to gather the information to do what we might consider a proper job of making a decision. So this is my talk in one slide, and I'll come back to this at the end. But for those of you who are very short of time, this is probably sufficient. Basically, what I'm going to talk about is that the way that we make decisions, and I'm going to use the words analysis and decision making together quite a lot here, because I'm an analyst. Okay, so I spent my whole life and career helping people make decisions and doing analysis to help them. And analysis is something that I do in my head when I make a decision, and maybe it's a different process. But these two attributes of a decision are interchangeable, and they're both very important: decision making and analysis. And the way we make decisions and the way we analyze those decisions there isn't a single way of doing it. There isn't a best way of doing it. And it varies depending on the complexity and urgency of the problem that we're trying to solve. And I will contend that today's AI is developing very much from one end of that spectrum, from the simple, urgent problem end of that spectrum. It's doing amazingly well, and it's developing rapidly, but that's where it comes from. But many problems that we face are at the other end of the spectrum, as we talked about earlier. So I'm going to talk about 4 ways that we can help to tackle problems at that end of the spectrum, which is the complex and urgent end of the spectrum. So these are testing plans. They're some analytical robustness methods, and I'll talk about decision making under deep uncertainty as an organization that's come up with some of these methods. but also things like large language model-based planners and logical analysis tools. And I'm going to finish predominantly talking about the last one of those because that's what I think is a way to bring a lot of these methods together. So let's take each of those points in turn. First of all, how do we make decisions? Well, I would argue that decisions and the analysis approaches that sort of sit hand in hand with them vary with the complexity and urgency of the situation or the problem that we're trying to solve. So when you ask people how people make decisions, they'll often tell you that, oh, it's the OODA loop, right? That's how we make decisions. It's the OODA loop because some guy in the 50s had this great idea that that's how he made decisions. So that must be how we make all decisions. And I'm probably being a little unfair, but I hear this phrase used an awful lot, and I think there's a degree of sense in it, but I also think it's nonsense when applied to many of the decisions that we actually make today. And I'll explain why. So it's just not quite as simple as this. And this is kind of a framework that I'll be using throughout the talk today to describe why and how we make decisions in different ways for different types of problem. And I'm going to use two axes. The first, the y-axis here, describes the level of complexity and uncertainty. It's a hodgepodge of those two different things sort of combined together. If I had three axes, it would be better, but I'm putting it on 2 dimensions. So what we're talking about, things at the top are things that are very complex and they're what I would call deeply uncertain problems. And things at the bottom are less complex and they have low uncertainty. And then the x-axis here is about urgency. So we're talking about how quickly you need to act on the decision you're making. So you might be lucky enough and have hours or days or weeks or years or decades in some cases to actually act on your decision. Or you might need to make a decision immediately. And that's how urgent that problem is. So I'm going to simplify the y-axis here rather than talking about different levels of complexity and deep uncertainty. I'm going to make an approximation. And I'm going to use the Cynefin scale. Cynefin, for those of you who are not familiar, is a pretty simple concept created by a guy called Dave Snowden to describe different habitats, as he calls them. Cynefin is the Welsh word for habitat, and there are 4 different habitats within which he argues we apply different approaches or should apply different approaches to making decisions. The latest nomenclature has all 4 with C names like clear, complicated, complex, and chaotic. But I'm going to focus on those descriptors of different levels of complexity and uncertainty today. And also for urgency, I'm going to use metrics that go roughly from sort of decades to milliseconds for making decisions. So how do we make decisions today? Well, I would argue we use many different approaches as humans and as machines and human-machine teams to solve problems, depending on how much time we have and how complicated the problem is. So I'll talk about each of these in a minute, but it's not as simple as we just use the OODA loop, and we use it differently in all these places. We use different approaches. So today's AI, and I'm already out of date because today's AI is slightly different from yesterday's AI already, but it is developing, I would argue, from the bottom right of this spectrum, from the space where you have to make a decision very quickly in a relatively simple situation. And what I mean by simple or clear, it's a slightly unfortunate terms. Simple doesn't mean that it's a simple problem. It means it's a solved problem. So a clear problem is something that we've looked at mathematically and we've managed to simplify it to a situation where making a decision on that problem is just using an algorithm that's already been written, or recognizing a pattern, or using looking for using a checklist and looking for specific indicators that you're in this situation. And if you're in this situation, you always do this. But that's what clear or simple means in the Cynefin scale. So as a result, it's quite easy to automate this. You just have to recognize the situation you're in and act accordingly. And this is where I would argue we use the OODA loop, or machines use the OODA loop too, in a continuous process of decision making. And that could be an individual or a machine, and it's using these sort of, if it's a machine, it's using pre-written models. There's nobody in there hard coding and changing the models. You're using a model that everyone's agreed is acceptable, it's good, and that tells you what to do when you recognize particular situations. And you recognize those situations from observed data. So you look at the world, you go, is this happening? If it is, I have to take this action. If it isn't, I have to take that action. So an example here would be the phalanx gun. It's basically told to shoot down something that's going at a certain speed, at a certain height, in a certain direction, when it's given the authority to do so. And it's just looking for those parameters. And then there's lots of complicated algorithms to make sure it actually hits that thing. But that's effectively the kind of simple rules that it's following. So these are procedural decisions, and you can give the same decisions to humans. You know, if you look at the decisions that are going on in a sentry's head standing outside a gate at an army base, they've probably been given pretty simple rules most of the time. You know, if someone attacks, you defend, you get on the phone or the radio and you call for backup. Otherwise, you're just polite to people, but don't engage too much, don't get distracted. You know, simple rules. So that's what we mean by procedural decisions. And humans on their own, individual humans, and basic classic AI, so automation and classical machine learning, are really good at helping us to do this, to recognize different patterns in different situations. But what about if you're in a situation where you just don't have a simple situation anymore? You've got a complex or complicated or chaotic problem. The difference between complicated and complex and chaotic is a little stretched, but basically complicated, think of it as something that you could solve if you had enough time with a mathematical type analytical scientific process. So I could write the code, I could modify the code in my phalanx gun to do something different if the world changed. And if I just used that approach, that would be solving a complicated problem. A complex problem is one that's not really solvable in its entirety, but it is nonetheless something that you can get close to understanding. And a chaotic problem is broadly something you shouldn't really take much effort in trying to solve because it's just too difficult, too messy, too unpredictable. So in a situation where you don't have pre-written rules, it's a novel situation. The way we deal with these kind of things at the moment is if you don't have much time, you have well-trained people. If you think about it, you know, how much effort goes into training military people, it's substantial. And the reason for that is because you want them, first of all, to know the rules about how to behave in these kind of situations, but also to have the ability to adapt and develop new tactics and new rules when they encounter a situation that they haven't encountered previously. Now, people are quite good at this. There's evidence to say that experts are very good at this. They use recognition primed decision making. They sort of spiral in to the right solution. It's no longer an OODA loop. Is it this? Is it this? Is it this? No. Is it this? Yes. Do it. It's now a spiraling process where they look to recognize what's going on in the situation, and they maybe match the situation to a pattern from a previous experience or for some training they had. They run that through, sort of simulate it in their heads about whether they should follow the same plan they did then, and they go, oh no, that didn't work, that won't work, so now I'll change it. And they kind of get closer and closer, and eventually they get enough of an idea about what to do that they act. But they do so well with less time pressure, and they do so badly under greater uncertainty and complexity. So humans aren't perfect at this, but given enough training and expertise, they get better at it. So how about using LLMs or generative models to help them? There's emerging evidence that actually LLMs are really good at pattern matching like this, looking for similar situations in the past that had plans that worked then. So why not apply them to this situation? And they're great at generating hypotheses. They may not be great though at long-term planning or planning against adversaries that are producing unexpected events, but they're still useful. And I think over time, they're going to be extremely helpful to experts in this space where they have to make decisions rapidly, but they don't have time to consider all of the options available to them. And generative models just may be able to consider a more broad spectrum of inputs in the time that's available to the experts. However, we've just talked for a fair bit about the problems at the bottom right of this spectrum. And as George mentioned earlier, many of the problems that we as humans face are at the other end of this spectrum. And what do I mean by that? Well, the top left of this spectrum, where we have really complicated, complex, or chaotic problems to solve, maybe we have a bit longer. Maybe we're lucky enough to have hours, weeks, months, or even years or decades to solve those problems. So what I've mapped here are a range of different approaches that we use in addition to the intuitive decision making we've just been talking about and the procedural decision approach that I talked about earlier. I'll talk through each of those now, but as you can see, I would say that there's a number of distinct ways in which people work together in teams, typically in this kind of space. And it's important to think about teams of people because the reason they work in teams is because some of these problems are so difficult that individuals find them too difficult to tackle on their own, but they can share the load and work more effectively as a team, especially when they have time to do so, where they have time to communicate between themselves. Then working in a team can be more effective than working as an individual. However, teams, just like individuals, are still better at the problems to the bottom left of this area here. And I would argue that they struggle to make effective decisions when they're dealing with truly complex or even chaotic systems, and especially when they have to do so in hours, or if they're lucky enough, maybe days or weeks. Typically, some of these problems can take months or even years to get a good understanding of. So let's have a look at the first approach that I would like to talk about here that people use, and this is what I would call analytical planning, which is essentially a group of people using a bureaucratic approach to split a problem into its component parts, share them out amongst the team members, try and work on building a better understanding of each of those parts in isolation, often working as individuals as they do so, working out what you might do to solve each of those parts of the problem, and then synthesizing the results of that analysis back together. I'm using the word bureaucratic in its original sense here. This is not meant to be pejorative in any way, but the nature of bureaucracy is creating large organizations and allocating tasks most efficiently and effectively between people within those organizations to achieve a goal that maybe they couldn't achieve individually. And that's the approach that we tend to use when given a problem of this nature. And it's when you look at how military planners operate, it is particularly how they tend to work on organizational tasks. And they can be extremely effective at this. So that's the analytical planning approach, but I would argue that this is effective when you have a complicated problem. And what I mean by that, as I said earlier, is a problem that can be solved given enough time using effectively mathematical methods or reductionist approaches, as you can see here. The other thing to bear in mind is that you need a finite amount of time to do this. It's a difficult process. Individuals can take days or even weeks to conduct their part of the project. And those parts need to be stitched together or synthesized. So overall, a task like this can take weeks or months, sometimes even years to do. Now, if you've got a more complex problem, it's harder to know for sure that you can split it into its component parts because you don't necessarily know what those component parts are. And the relationships between them aren't as clear either. So what we tend to do when we have a complex problem is work in a much more loose framework than the last approach. And I've worked on a number of defense reviews and large reviews of organizational design and things like that. What tends to happen in these kind of things is you split into work streams and you have workshops where people ideate potential solutions to the problem, but they're not really sure what the overall problem is. So there's a fair degree of uncertainty about whether you've tackled the most important parts of the problem. And also, almost certainly, with a complex problem, you would have missed some really important solutions or parts of the solution. So what we tend to see with this kind of activity is large teams of people who are effectively working as a loose team, and they're scanning for useful information. Often they're unsure exactly what they need to do, so there's a fair degree of guesswork involved. They may be lucky enough to experiment and have time to try things out, but on the whole, they will be pulling together proposals that have a huge amount of uncertainty associated with them. And what I mean by that is they won't have solved the problem, but they may have come up with useful tactics that can be employed to tackle the problem. Sometimes, though, the problems are so difficult that there isn't really a useful corpus of knowledge out there that people can go and find by scanning for it. And this is the situation that we faced in the UK when we were planning for the Iraqi counterinsurgency campaign. And although there were prior experiences of counterinsurgency campaigns, they were very different in their nature to the one that was being undertaken at the time. And we didn't know at the time how best to go about doing an operation where your options were as broad as, for instance, building schools or attacking insurgents or creating a new organizational structure within local government. You know, the range of options was enormous. There was no sort of regular model of which options were the most effective to undertake. And so it actually required a degree of new science, developing new social science in this case, to understand how those relatively broad options interacted with one another. Having said that's really difficult, in my mind, the most challenging place to be on this chart is in this space, which is where you have a complex problem that needs solving in hours. And I call this a rapid planning situation. This is the one that you tend to see with military planners who are operating on a real operation as opposed to planning a potential operation in the future. So they are responding to an intelligent adversary. They are having to act fast to get ahead of that adversary. There is an enormous amount of uncertainty about the situation. They don't have perfect intelligence, and they need to make decisions quickly and effectively. So they use similar approaches to the ones that we just talked about, where you basically have to rapidly make sense about the situation that you're in, and then decide how best to undertake, which actions were most likely to give you some positive advances. And what they tend to do is bringing methods from analytical planning from below, which is suitable for complicated problems, or methods from the collaborative strategy, which are suitable for problems where you have plenty of time. And of course, neither of these work perfectly because you don't have enough time to do collaborative strategy making, and you don't have a simple enough problem to do analytical planning. So instead, you're left with a lot of guesswork, and as Eisenhower said, often you get plans that are useless. And his point was that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. And I interpret that as the act of planning is itself extremely valuable, and it gives you the knowledge that you need to rapidly replan when you discover something is wrong with your plan. And so the plan itself might be useless, but the act of planning was indispensable. So that's one of the challenges that people have when dealing with this space. We just don't have the tools with which to tackle this type of a problem. So how can we do that? What can we do to make this type of problem, that of an urgent but complex problem, solvable, or at least something that's manageable? Well, the first thing I would argue is that most of the things that I'm going to talk about now are about different forms of testing your plan to make sure you've got enough. You thought of the things that you might have missed. And the most simple thing to think about is, that actually testing plans by having intelligent people question you and maybe challenge some of your assumptions and challenge that you think that plan's going to be effective, or why do you think it's going to be effective? And that kind of approach is a very quick and simple way of highlighting areas in which you may have missed something. And in effect, it's bringing in some of the approaches that we use in this intuitive decision space, because what it's doing is helping you realize that you're not in the situation that you maybe recognized when you put your plan together. You may have thought that you were in a situation like one you were in 5 years ago, but actually when challenged, you realize that you've missed something, and actually you're in a situation that's slightly different, and therefore your plan from that time will not readily read across to this. So this approach of regularly challenging the plan enables you to take a more iterative approach, akin to the one that we talked about earlier, where you spiral in to the decision-making process rather than sort of coming up with a perfect plan and then bang, off you go. So why do we need to test plans? I would argue that, look, I mean, look, I've met a lot of military guys and a lot of military planners, and they are some of the most convincing, compelling people I have talked to. As a deeply uncertain analyst or scientist or engineer myself, I almost always found the military guys far more believable than I was, and I thought, oh well, these guys really know what they're doing. We should follow their plan. They've really thought about this, and sometimes that's a good thing, because if you want to lead someone over the front, you've got to do that. But actually, if you're trying to find faults in a plan, that's not a good way to approach things. And it's great that people can come up with really compelling solutions, but really every plan is going to miss out on something. It's going to miss some of the important factors. I would argue that planners always misunderstand something about the environment, or I would also argue that they will fail to predict how their adversary might react to their plans. And although experience helps, and the more experience you have, then maybe the less of these things you're likely to miss. We still need to test plans to make them robust. And in military doctrine today, NATO's AJP5 basically says, if you look here, there was a sort of COA analysis, or course of action analysis, and then a course of action validation and comparison. This is all basically about testing the plan before you present it to the commander. But having worked with a lot of these guys, I know that time is often spent, instead of testing and changing the plan, it's spent improving the plan, filling in gaps, and adding more detail, which is a very attractive thing to do when you've got an incomplete plan. But it might mean that you miss the wood for the trees, because you focus in on this detail and filling in the detail, and you miss the fact that the plan actually as a whole is not complete. So can you test plans? Wargaming, simulation, these are great, right? If you've got time, but wargaming takes hours, maybe days. Simulation can be very fast if you happen to have the simulation that's already perfectly describes the situation that you're in and allows you to test it thousands of times very quickly. That, by the way, is just never true. So wargaming simulation, lovely ideas, but really not feasible if you're trying to test a plan in many times in a matter of minutes or hours. But instead, what is quick and cheap is continuously challenging, getting people's wisdom and eliciting their wisdom and getting them to challenge each other's ideas and try and find the gaps in the plan and to integrate the new competing ideas as they come in. So that's the first. I guess I will send the slides out after this. So that's the first of the approaches. The second approach is one that we can borrow from the decision making under deep uncertainty community. This is a free to join organization. Highly recommend it to lots of people. It's got fascinating talks, and some of their methods are really valuable. But one of the things that they focus on is this idea of robustness. I'm just going to talk very briefly about this. Is a massive oversimplification, but I would argue that if you have a clear problem, the kind of analysis you're looking for is pattern matching. You're kind of looking for, am I in this situation or that situation? If you've got a complicated problem, then you have what I would call focused analysis. So think of that as building a spreadsheet of a new problem for the first time. If you've got a really chaotic problem, like we had, you could argue, in Iraq in 2005, then you actually go and need to develop new social science in that case to understand what on earth will happen if you invest money in schools and infrastructure and so on. But this approach called exploratory analysis is relatively quick and cheap, and it allows you to expand what you would do with what I would call focused analysis and just get a much quicker but rough idea of whether an idea or a plan is robust to a range of different assumptions. And this is one of my favorite charts from a guy called Paul Davis from RAND, which basically just describes the weaknesses with the kind of approach of analysis that I used to do. So I was asked questions, as were some of the people on this call, 20, 30 years ago, would the UK win or lose a war like this? And what we would do is define a war like this as one very, very specific war that we then analyzed in great detail. And after a period of probably 2 or 3 or 4 years, we would come back and say, yes, we would win, or no, we would lose. And people would say, thank you very much. Of course, that information could be that, yes, we would win or lose this war. But actually, if you change some of your really important uncertain factors, like how quickly the war would emerge, how much time you'd have to prepare, or how strong your adversary would be, then it might be that actually the vast majority of the time you're going to lose, and you just happen to pick the one chance where you're going to win. And that's a real weakness of analyzing things in depth without thinking about the breadth first. So what DMDU methods recommend with exploratory analysis is having a simple model, and that's not an easy thing to do, but build a simple model of something that you can run fast, and you can run it many times with lots of different numbers that represent different variables for the things that you're uncertain about. So building a simple model is really hard. It's like another quote from World War II hero, that I'm sorry I didn't have time to write a short letter from Churchill. I only had time to write a long one. It's similar when it comes to building models of the world. It's very easy to build a slow, complicated model of the world. It's really hard to work out what matters and only model what matters and boil that down to the core factors that you need to keep in your model. So it's now simple and fast enough to do this kind of analysis with. And so that's a real problem. So how can we do that? I'll come back to that. But if you can do it, if you can build a quick running simple model of the situation that you face, you can then rapidly run that many, many times and see most of the time this plan is going to work, or most of the time this plan is not going to work. And more importantly, what are the factors I need to look out for that push us into one of these red zones, the area where we always lose or we're likely to lose. Okay, so AI is going to change everything that we do, I'm sure. But if you look at the sort of cutting edge planning systems that are being developed now using large language models or teams of these adversarially working together and things like that, they could perhaps help us resolve this problem where at the moment humans are using these kind of methods from analytical planning or from collaborative strategy to help with rapid planning. And we've got this problem. Maybe applying LLMs will help us do this analytical planning task quicker and more efficiently, more effectively. And if we can do that, then instead of that taking months and weeks, maybe we can do that in minutes. Now, there's still then a problem of trust, like I talked about earlier, but that might free up the time of the humans to spend more time being critical and testing plans. I think there's a real potential for LLM-based planning systems to work alongside humans here, not to replace them entirely, but to replace some of these slow and rather mechanistic bits of the planning process. However, the same issues I talked about at the moment, that are problems with humans, they're really good at telling you why their plan is great, also apply to large language models. They're designed to give you a really good narrative. They're designed to be compelling. They're designed to be persuasive. They're not designed to be entirely honest. And I don't mean that in any kind of negative way. That's just, this is what they are designed to be good at. And therefore you need to be very careful asking an LLM whether you should trust it, asking it what it's missed out of its plan. And both humans and these kind of generative models at the moment are not good at helping you understand where their weaknesses are, where the weaknesses in the plan that they've come up with lie. Now, maybe that can be overcome with challenge through adversarial, one LLM to be an adversary and tackle and challenge the plans produced by another. Or maybe bringing humans in to challenge the plans produced by LLMs, or the other way around would be useful. The other thing that I would argue is that natural language is well, look, these are large language models, okay? They use the English language or other languages as their means of explaining things and conveying information. I would argue that that's great at providing believable arguments, but is it something that you can then mathematically test? And instead, I would argue that some kind of graphical knowledge graph-based approach would help us to use a more mathematical approach to testing the completeness of an argument or the validity of a logical argument. And therefore, I think expressing plans through some form of causal logic with causal graphs offers an opportunity to test how good your plan is or what is it missing. I'm not going to tell you that we've solved this yet, but I think there's something important here in avoiding the fluffy, flowery nature of English language and instead replacing it, at least within under the hood, in an analysis tool with a graphical interface that basically allows you to do mathematical calculations. So what do we have in the way of logical analysis tools? So my company, Cosimmetry, has been working on a tool we call Sketch, which is designed to help with a lot of these things. And I'll just use it as an example. There are other tools available that will help with some of this, that will help you as an individual or as a team of humans to elicit the wisdom that you have to help you solve a problem. But equally, it produces a graphical model that is then mathematically, you're able to run mathematical equations through, which will allow you to perform some form of simple testing of the model that you come up with. And then because it's graphical and it has a good user interface, will enable you to explain it a bit easier than if it was just a long, either a big spreadsheet in the model or if it was just a long waffly bit of text. So the idea behind it is that on the left-hand side of this chart, you basically use soft operational research techniques, which are broad and shallow, and they're focused on the human, the decision maker, and they're fast. They're not perfect, but they're quick and they're broad, and allow that to rapidly understand what matters when you're trying to solve a problem. Then take that understanding and build a model around it that looks at how to build a simple model. I talked earlier about simple models that's deep or relatively deep and narrow, but only in the areas that you find are important to the problem that you're trying to solve. It's focused on an analyst now, a more mathematical person. It's a bit slower to do this, but if you've made time by focusing on the right things in the first place, then you won't waste time building detailed models of things that don't matter. And this is a hard operational research or quantitative data science type approach. And then having done that and use the simple models to analyze things, you can then communicate back using this kind of logical, graphical causal logic to the decision makers what you found and why. And again, using the sort of decision maker focused interface here, broad and shallow. These things matter, these things don't. That's the sort of thing you're giving them rather than the precise details, and you can do that quite quickly. So the kind of processes that we're developing basically allow teams of people to brainstorm ideas and use a simple way of capturing the challenges that they have thought that they're trying to solve, get it all on the page in this case, then use some thematic analysis to identify what the most critical factors are. What are the things that really matter to us? And I can talk about examples of this, but I'm just going to kind of whiz through the general approach. Then build a causal model that says how you would achieve change with the factors that really matter. So an example might be if you're trying to stop children vaping, what are the things you would do that would cause fewer children to vape? Maybe you make the vapes less attractive. Maybe you make them more expensive. Maybe you put out health education information to make people less inclined to vape. So those are the sort of things. And building a very simple model with different thicknesses of the links between things helps people to just intuitively say, yeah, that's more important than this. Then help them to visually analyze that, which is what we see on the example on the right here. And you can see that if I hover over this node, it has this effect on the system. It propagates through the system in this way. So it gives people a sort of causal understanding. If I do this, it'll have this effect. And the people that build this model are not detailed, they're not detailed analysts. They are the people who have to solve the problem. And it's so easy to use that the idea is that they buy into the model as they build it. It's their model, it's not someone else's. And as a result, it's easy and compelling to explain the theory of change. That whole process, as you can see there, takes about a day. Now, that's a long time. Okay, and if you're in a military operation and you need to decide whether to go left or right, you haven't got time to do this. So this is not suitable for the bottom right of that decision-making spectrum I talked about earlier, but it is suitable for the military planning bit, and hence, as a result, yes, OR does stand for Operational Research. So how else would you do this to do something a little bit more mathematical? I'll show you some examples, but I know I'm a bit short on time. But basically, developing a simple conceptual model of a system allows you to then build that model of a system into a simulation of that system, a simple one, and we would recommend, rather than a more complex one. And that then allows you to vary inputs and mathematically calculate the impact that will have on the outputs that you desire. So here's an example of building a model from multiple experts. I talked to multiple experts about a problem. We used a little bit of AI and a lot of brain power to converge their models into a single model that represented all of their views. We then, from that, extracted what the key factors were and built a much more simple simulation of just the key factors in that situation, which then allowed us to work out which variables had the greatest impact on the outcomes they were looking for, and allowed us to make recommendations about what to do. So here's an example. This is a year old, in fact, more than a year old. So this was an example of looking at what Israel and Hamas might do next, just after October the 7th, 2023. And this was a discussion with a senior academic who was an expert on the Middle East and his view at the time of what Israel might do and why. And it's just a messy causal diagram where I asked him what actions Israel might take, and they were the things shown in green here. And I said, well, why might they do that? And then you take an edge from that node up to the next node, which is a blue one here, which is sort of an intermediate level outcome. And then what else might they do to achieve that? Why might that not work? And then eventually, well, what are the ultimate goal they're trying to achieve? And this is just one person's view. He did that 3 times, and then converged 3 models from 3 different experts into a single model to get a rough idea of collectively what they thought Israel might do and why, what they thought Hamas might do and why, and so on. And we have some simple AI tools that help you basically to merge different mental models, but this is extremely challenging to do intellectually and mathematically. It's not easy. So at the moment, this is based on relatively simple NLP type approaches, looking for similar words and so on. But one of the challenges doing this is that people use their own words to create a model, which is the right thing to do because they then buy into it. But there is, in doing so, they create a messy ontology. And everyone's ontology is not rigorous or strict. And what I mean by that is their models all use slightly different words for the same meaning, for the same node. And it's really hard to combine those. We'll talk later about that. So having converged the models into a single model, this was one model that combined all of the insights from 3 different experts. We then started looking at which of these links are the strongest, which are very weak links. And you can then play tools with this, what we call visual analytics, which helps you to understand, well, if I hover over any one of these things, in this case, we've been hovering over the objective, which is that Hamas is no longer governing in Gaza, then what are the actions that have the most likelihood of achieving that outcome? And that's just with very simple high, medium, low scores for each of these causal links. So it's very simple maths, but it allows you to very quickly make some basic calculations. And this is the other side of that equation. So I'm not going to talk in any more detail about that, but basically, having built a causal model, you can then turn that into in this case, a stock and flow simulation or other types of simulation. So a stock and flow simulation is one type of way in which you can use calculations to test elements of your plan using Sketch or a tool like it. There are others though, and we've got other types of simulation like time stepping simulations, also just raw calculations where basically you use each of the nodes to make calculations based on the inputs that they receive from the nodes that feed into them. or you can focus your calculations on probabilities. And I think this is a particularly valuable way of thinking about things. If you set your overall objective at the top of a tree, like you can see here, you can look at the different activities that are necessary for that objective to be achieved, and so on and so forth, creating a whole tree of actions with probabilities that you can, in this case, you can sort of drag up and down the probabilities of the leaf nodes in the tree and see how those propagate all the way through till you eventually get to the trunk, which is where your objective is set. And that allows you to understand which are the factors that have the greatest, strongest relationship when you vary them to the overall objective you're trying to achieve. So I guess the key point is there are a number of ways in which, having built a logical model in a tool like Sketch, you can use that mathematically to develop meaningful insights into whether or not that plan will be effective. Having done so as well, another advantage of having a graphical tool, I believe, is that it's actually helpful for explaining the theory of change. And what I mean by that is why you believe that your plan will be effective. And there are two ways of thinking about this. One is that it's actually clear to convey the logic in a fashion where we are saying that, you know, one activity leads to another, which leads to another, which leads to another, and it's a causal logic effectively, and allows that to make it very clear and explicit, and then people can challenge it. But also, this does make it easy to challenge. You can say, these are the specific points I'm making in my argument, and encourage people to find what's wrong with them and challenge them. As long as this graph is relatively small, and what I mean by that is you have a relatively small number of nodes, it's easy to test and to explain it to people. And I think it's a much less woolly way of explaining why you think your plan is a good idea than using normal text and narrative is. So in summary, just going back over the presentation as a whole, what I've been saying overall is that I think it's really important not just to celebrate the incredible advances that have been made with AI recently, but to think about how AI and related tools can help us as humans to make wiser decisions in the kind of situation that we face every day, in fact, often every hour, which is making quite a complex decision with very little time, and more importantly, perhaps very little data or readily available data to do so. And the key points that I would emphasize here are that, you know, that how we make decisions varies with the complexity and urgency of the problem. So the more time we have, the more chance we have of gathering data and using a more mechanistic or reductionist approach. But the more complex the problem, the less likely that those kind of approaches are going to be suitable and effective at helping find a real true solution to the problem that we have. And I'd argue that today's AI is developing from one end of the spectrum, that is the simple and urgent end of that spectrum, where AI today is incredibly well suited and incredibly effective. Having said that, many of the problems we face are at this other end, where you have a really complex problem, and you may not have decades to solve it, but it may be something you need to solve within the next few days or weeks, and that is still incredibly challenging. We have a range of different ways that we as humans, and often operating in teams, tackle these problems. But I think there are 4 things we can do to make these approaches for decision making and planning more effective. And in simple terms, they are testing plans using analytical robustness methods like the ones developed by the Society for Decision Making Under Deep Uncertainty, using large language model based planners to ideate and come up with new potential solutions to our problems, but also to help us draw on the broader knowledge base of people who've been there before us, who've been in similar situations, and helping us recognize when we're close to those situations. And finally, I believe that logical analysis tools like the sketch planner that I've just shown you can help people to use these types of approaches, rapidly building simple models of a problem, and then using a mathematical set of tools to quickly draw some meaningful insights from those, and then using the graphical approach, not just to collaborate and explain their ideas to one another, but also to explain them to people up and down the chain. in a more effective manner than would have been possible with just text and graphics. So in summary, that's the overall message. If you'd like to find out more about Sketch, then I'm very happy to talk more about it. Please email me on rob@cosimmetry.co.uk. Thanks very much. And each of those are then developing their plans. And there was something very human about this process. That's what we do. That's what we do that's what you guys do in DSTL. I did it when I was in DSTL. It's what military people do. It's what people in business do. It's just the natural way of planning when you have time. Collaborative strategy, though, I mean, I'm not deeply involved in supporting operations in Ukraine, so I can't comment in any great detail. But collaborative strategy is where you have time to sit back and think about what really matters. And, I think, for example, I'm going to make a complete guess, but President Zelensky's idea, his victory plan to invade a bit of Russia to enable them to hold that as a bargaining chip against the Russian occupation of the Donbass, is an example where they sort of go back and they sit outside the box and say, well, what could we do that's not going to, instead of trying to stop what they're doing, it's how do we get back and step back and take a broader look at this? And that's the sort of thing that comes from this collaborative strategy approach. So it's just stopping, focusing on the immediate tactical problem and sitting back and saying, what else could we do? But I don't know to what extent any of this is being automated. All of the tools I'm aware of being used out there are really quite data driven. They're all quite bottom up. They're the bottom right of that diagram, the sort of AI tools that you hear about, very much sort of, how to do tactical things better. So I don't know if they're being used. I'm not aware of anything that's being used at the top left of this chart.
Thanks, Rob. Someone also, actually, it's Jay again, also asked, will the slides be sent out? So if you'd like to send me the slides, Rob, then I'll happily distribute them to the people who attended.
Happy to do that. Yeah.
And then there's a follow-on question from Jay as well about how do we find the optimal point in the complexity urgency problem space?
I mean, so I'm not sure there is an optimal point. I think every problem you have just appears somewhere on that spectrum. So, I need to decide right after this whether I'm going to drive to Southampton. I've got about 15 minutes to make that decision, and it's a pretty tactical, complicated decision, but not complex. That's just the nature of that decision I've got to make. I suppose if I thought about it earlier in advance, I'd have given myself more time, and it would have been no more complicated. So there is probably a relationship. I would say that, I mean, one way of looking at this spectrum is this. I don't know if you can see my pointer, but basically, there's an axis that goes sort of broadly between the top left and the bottom right, and that is sort of what's achievable today. Anything above that is unachievable. So you want to try and bring your problem down into the bottom left-hand triangle of that space, and that, I would say, is about all we can do at the moment for optimization of your problem.
Okay, brilliant, thanks. And Al Banks has also put a paper in there, Responsible Use of Large Language Models, analogy with the Oxford tutorial system from Science Direct. So that's obviously there in the chat if anyone wants to sort of take note of that. Does operational OR stand for operational research? Yes, it does. And then Jay has asked, what types of mathematical equations are used in the LLMs?
And I think Al's responded there. I mean, arguably the LLMs are not making mathematical calculations. I mean, I know technically they are because they're using neural networks and so on. But effectively the LLMs, as they're used in planners at the moment, are being used to suggest text. So what might I do to solve this problem, and that kind of thing. So the equations are almost the next stage, which is once you've got a plan that the LM suggested that to cross the river, you need to build a bridge and then cross the river. You then have to test your effectiveness of that plan, and that is where you start bringing in equations to say how long does it take, and build a model, a simulation, or a spreadsheet to work out how effective that plan is.
And I'll then ask, does the modeling articulate value alignment?
I'm going to have to make. I don't know if Al wants to explain a little bit more about value
Yes.
alignment.
So you
Yeah.
mentioned weightings in your models. Now, naively, you could say each weighting was an alignment to your own values because you weight
Yes.
each element. But I'm thinking about larger scale values where actually the aggregation of values that might be tiny differences across the model might actually have significant impact in value alignment of the model with our own values of it.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that, so when you say does the modeling articulate it, I think at the moment we've asked people not for how important is each outcome, but how likely is each action to help lead to cause each outcome. So it's not how much do I care about this outcome, which is what I would traditionally regard as a definition of value or my values. It is just likelihood or a degree of causal effect. Now, I suppose that could be biased by whether people want it to happen or not, but essentially the model we would generate here is just what's the likely outcome of doing this action and what actions are the ones that are most likely to cause this outcome, if I wanted it that way. One of the things that I'm very alive to is this idea that every action has a side effect or many side effects, and we need to be able to show that there are multiple side effects. This is a real problem. This diagram here of showing a pyramid is is a complete falsity when you think about it. And there's one of my favorite charts from a guy who was a fellow of the Operational Research Society, a guy called John Friend, is that for every leader, that's how they see the world. They see themselves at the top of a massive pyramid with lots of people underneath them doing their jobs for them. Every person at the bottom of that pyramid sees themselves with a massive pyramid above them of more and more people telling them what to do at more and more senior levels. And they've got all these competing objectives coming from multiple people. Now, these could be seen as competing values or just competing objectives from multiple commanders. And I think this is a real challenge that basically we might come up with the optimum way of crossing a river, but in so doing, fail at all of our other objectives. So you have to constantly be aware of what side effects of diverting resources to achieve your outcome will have. And that is not a problem I can solve easily. But I think it's important to challenge people to say, what will you not be able to achieve if you divert resources to achieve this outcome, and try and represent that in some way and show to what extent do I care about each of those objectives and try and give a sort of weighted sum of overall effectiveness.
Thanks, Rob. I think that links into a question that we've had from John here. He says he has a human-based question, paraphrasing one of his heroes, Anthony Hopkins, i.e. that the perception of certainty is the problem, not uncertainty per se. So what tips do you have, having worked with senior military staff and civil servants, to encourage broader thinking stroke self-questioning?
It's a really good question, and there isn't an easy answer, but I think one thing we've discovered, I think, is that people's fear of failure is real. Even people who are very certain that they will succeed, you need to put them in the mindset of you've just failed. So you go through a sort of pre-mortem process, or if that isn't working, actually put them in a war game where they fail and get them to use that fear and to turn it into something valuable, which is a revision to their plan or a revised set of certainties about their likelihood of succeeding. So that's the main thing: is to harness people's fear of failure, however certain they appear on the outside, and maybe do it in private, or maybe give them the opportunity to be challenged by one person and to really rigorously challenge them. Those sort of approaches, I think, work quite well.
Thanks. We've also got a question here from Jennifer Badham, who says she's in the social policy space, and they do something similar with slightly different language. The visual main factor simple model would be called participatory systems mapping. And the key difference is that they construct maps in workshops, hence the participation bit. So where people challenge at the time. The Israel Hamas example combined 3 separate maps. Is there a specific reason for doing them separately and then combining them?
That's a really good question, Jennifer. And I mean, our tool allows you to do it in workshops or to combine, and there are others available and so on as well. I know that Colin Eden and Fran Ackerman started looking at separate maps and combining them. Then they went very much to a sort of group explorer approach where it's better to challenge and get everyone to buy in at the time. I think these are both complementary methods. You can use either. The reason that we built 3 separate maps and combined them was just we were talking to people, one in the Middle East, one in America, one in the UK, for no money, and we didn't have time to arrange workshops and things. Having said that, I think the advantage of people, the ideal approach would be to talk to people individually, get their unedited, unfiltered ideas out of their heads with their own language, then involve them in the merging process as a group session. And that way you're not biasing the merging initially, at least by who has the loudest voice. You've got everyone's ideas clearly expressed, and then you're converging them in the merging session.
Really quick one as well, if we can, because we are practically out of time. Paul has said, have you looked at using existing ontologies to describe rather than constrain the more free-form sets of concept users may come up with?
I think what he's saying, yes, to describe rather than constrain. That's a really interesting idea. I haven't yet, Paul. I'd love to talk more about that. But basically, what we've been looking at is how to change the structure of graphs. Almost, you start with 3 separate ones, and you literally force them into a 4th that has a rigid ontology. I'd be very interested in what you're talking about there.
And then there's a final question here from Guy Mason. Isn't the use of LLM counterintuitive to coming up with a novel solution to a problem which the enemy won't have thought of? As LLMs are based on the likelihood of words being said together, that's the opposite of a novel or surprising solution, which is more likely to come from diverse human thought. If you can sum that one up really quickly, it'd be brilliant.
I mean, I think just very briefly, LLMs are kind of trained on the entire corpus of human written knowledge. Therefore, there's an awful lot of stuff that you won't have thought of as an individual that's in the training data for the LLM. And we found that LLMs are surprisingly good at coming up with 100 ideas about what you might do about something. If you just say, give me top 5, it'll give you 5 pretty conventional ones. If you want 100 ideas, it'll give you some quite surprising stuff that you wouldn't have thought of yourself. So that's the advantage, I think, of using them in a sort of brainstorming approach.
And obviously, if anyone has any further questions, when I send the slides out, your email address is on that last slide. I assume you're quite happy to have people email you and sort of carry on.
Oh, yes, please do.
The discussions, yes. and chat about it. There's also one person in there who actually wants to work for you as well. So I think you might get CVs thrown at you as well. And finally, just thank you very, very much. Thank you, Rob. It was an absolutely fascinating talk. Brilliant.
Oh, thank you. I've really enjoyed it. Real pleasure.
Good.
Lovely to see everyone again.
Okay.
All the best.
Yeah. All right. Thanks then, Rob.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, Rob. Great stuff.
Thank you. Bye.